Spears, do you see this, and what are you able to do about it? I'll start in the middle. So Senator.
What's going on?
And I'm sorry, an erosion of
Public trust.
Public trust. Well, I think certainly in some respects, in Massachusetts, in some ways, the Massachusetts legislature, which those of you who are from Massachusetts probably know it's a very democratic state, but generally most legislation that passes in Massachusetts is fairly bipartisan. There's not too many Republican elected officials, but most legislation passes in a bipartisan manner. But what I have seen in the Republican Party is that the Massachusetts Republican Party has really shifted very far to the right, such that the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Charlie Baker, who's more of a moderate Democrat, has essentially created a separate entity to support more moderate Republicans. And unfortunately, what I've seen is that the Massachusetts Republican Party, is putting out, mailings that I think are fairly inaccurate, not only directed at Democrats, but at moderate Republicans. So I certainly think there's been some erosion on that side. I think on the Democratic side, and I'm I guess categorized as a progressive Democrat, there's certainly those on the left that I think have also engaged in a lot of attacks if someone doesn't have a pure record on certain issues. So I think I've seen that as well. And as far as the media, and this is obviously not just the Massachusetts phenomenon, it's really sad to see. It's just that local media has really gone away. So in the district I represent, there once were approximately 25 weekly papers. Now there's about 10 weekly papers, and most of them are owned by multinational corporations. So there's not a lot of local content. And so, the question that a lot of us are asking in the legislature is, who is going to cover, the work we're doing and make sure that, quite honestly, as elected officials, we're held accountable. And so that's really going away, and what can be done to replace that or supplant that, whether it's blogs or local media, and how do people get perhaps compensated to do that kind of work to cover what's going on in the media, and therefore what's going on in the State House is much less covered. There was a time when I started out the legislature, there were approximately 10 daily papers, each of whom had a reporter assigned to the State House. Now it's really just the Boston Globe and maybe one other publication. So in that sense, I think that's eroded, and I'm not sure what's going to replace that.
Thank you. Neeraj.
So I'll talk about partisanship and then public trust, and then on Kashmir. I'll make a defense of partisanship. Partisanship exists because there are real differences. People have real disagreements, right? If we talk about foreign policy, there are Americans who support Pakistan, and there are Americans who support India. Why would we tell them to say, well, abandon your principles and come together? Partisanship is good. Discourse is good. Disagreement is good. The problem is when disagreement becomes disagreeable, right? And in the media and in Congress, it's become what I call a real daytime soap opera, right? It is no longer about discourse on real issues. It is a soap opera meant to have a political victory, right? And the national media and the National Congress play right into that. And I think that erodes the public trust. When the public does not see its elected leaders and its fourth estate, the national media, advancing an agenda to do something for the public good, that is when public trust is eroded. On the issue of Kashmir, I know the question wasn't about that, but I will say, as a Hindu elected official, it is very frustrating to me. The Indian American and Hindu community have done incredible work in supporting those of us, and I have received a lot of that support, and I am very thankful. But why any Indian or Hindu American would ever support an elected official who has spoken against the revocation of 370 is beyond me. Okay? And I'll go a step further. When a member of Congress who looks like us speaks against the revocation of 370, which is effectively saying that what would happen to Kashmiri Pandits is okay. When someone that looks like us does that, that is probably the worst thing that could happen. Because then a member of Congress who doesn't look like us, when they see someone who looks like us do that, well, they say, well, that must be okay then. If a Hindu Indian American member of Congress is against the revocation of 370, is against the government of India's actions, then it must be okay, right? And that is a huge problem, right? And so, you know, not to be partisan, but the American left, there is a problem. There is a problem with what I call radical Islam and their influence on the American left. And when you have CARE, and you know, HAF will show you their budget versus CARE's budget, advancing Pakistan's agenda, which is an anti-Hindu agenda, we have a big problem. And so, you know, I would urge you and urge everyone in your networks to think about who you're supporting and whether they are actually doing things for Hindu Americans.
So I will say, while we want to have our values as a Democrat or as a Republican or as an independent, I think hyper-partisanship causes lack of public trust. And one of the things that my background as a Hindu is that there's no one right way. There are many ways to the truth. Ekam Sat Vigraha Bahuda Vadanti. And that's what I think is why I won. I'm the first Democrat to ever hold this seat. I'm the first immigrant to ever hold this seat. I'm the second woman. And so the reason that the constituents of Troy and Clawson in Michigan gave me their trust is because I didn't believe in this hyper-polarization where, like Neeraj said, where we're disagreeable, but also I think that things need to be negotiated. And we're seeing where we're unwilling to negotiate. And my experience is sometimes I have to negotiate not only within my own family, but within my own self. Because, you know, there might be a day where there's Halloween might fall on Diwali, so which one do I celebrate, right? I mean, those simple things happen for us. And so I think it's really critical that we show that we are able to navigate these spaces as elected officials to reestablish public trust. As a state representative, I also carry a very specific, I've been a public Hindu. I've been a board member of the Hindu American Foundation. Locally, I started an interfaith organization, so any question about Hinduism always came to me. I was the public Hindu because every institution I went in wearing a sari with a bindi and speaking about being Hindu. So there's never any doubt that I was Hindu. And so people come to me now both to defend the issue of Kashmir and the abrogation of 370 and also to defend the plight of the Muslims in Kashmir to ensure that human rights is not violated. And the thing I will say is, if we don't look at the historical context, the global community, the national community, the local community has to make sure that they're educated, and that is one of the reasons that I ran, is because of education. I think there's really an opportunity for us to educate as Hindu leaders, as Hindu elected officials, what people don't know, that what happened in 88, 89 needs to be talked about to explain where we are today. What happened in 1947 when Kashmir chose to be part of India, and what has happened to the state of Kashmir since, whether it's Pakistan-occupied Kashmir or 1972 when part of Kashmir has become part of China. So you have to look at the whole historical context. And so as an Indian American with a background in advocacy through the Hindu American Foundation, I definitely feel I have a unique opportunity to talk about this as a much larger issue than just what is happening right now.
Thank you. I'm going to come to India and then to you, Jay. India, go ahead.
So, I've often thought about this issue, erosion of trust in the government, polarization, and I can speak about it, I think, within the context of my identity and work as someone who's not an elected official, but who works for a social justice organization. At times, I really have to struggle with fitting my identity and my values and my beliefs within particular situations or silos or contexts that really matter to me. So for instance, I'm a lawyer working for a Jewish, liberal, progressive organization that really stands by protecting the rights of refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants. And yes, this administration has made our work extremely difficult and at times very, very discouraging, both from a professional and from sort of a mental perspective. And I'm grateful for the support of my colleagues and the work they do in helping us, really fulfilling our mandate and our mission. And as someone who has identified as a lifelong Democrat and as a progressive millennial, so to speak, I also find myself very confused and heartbroken with a lot of the Hindu-phobic and alienating language coming out of the Democratic Party. And at times, I really do find myself ideologically confused and sometimes party homeless, not really knowing where to stand. On one side, I do support general, social justice issues, human rights issues. Generally, I'm more left of center, but now with the inflammatory rhetoric and Hindu-phobic verbiage that's coming out, at times I'm at a loss for words and don't really know where to turn. I've decided that my way of handling this is really to just do what I can in my own capacity to try as much as possible to bring these two identities together and be as inclusive as I can of other people and their disagreements. As an attorney, I greatly cherish the art of argument and nuanced debate. And it seems like we're really losing this art, not just in American society, but really in political circles around the world. We see politics becoming increasingly polarized. You're either a leftist communist or you're an alt-right conservative. And I sort of miss the intellectual nuance in the debate that we really should be valuing as an enlightened society. One example of how I've tried to fit myself within these different identities is recently, actually working with Jay, Hayes was able to take on the case of a Bangladeshi Hindu woman who is now applying for asylum. This is, I think, in Hayes' history, this may be our first, if not one of the first, cases we've taken on of an actual Hindu minority. And so this allows me to serve my community and my people while at the same time really honoring those social values I stand by, which is protection for refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. Turning to 1 second on the Kashmir issue, there's a lot of polarized talk around this, but I guess one experience I can briefly talk about is I did attend a Stand with Kashmir event with a Kashmiri Pandit friend of mine a couple of months ago. Very, very open-hearted and just willing to learn. I honestly didn't know much then about sort of Stand with Kashmir's platform or their speakers or materials, but I just wanted to go and learn more about this issue. And what truly horrified me at this event was prominent academicians and members of the intelligentsia and reporters actively denying that targeted killings happened with Pandits, actively denying that there was an exodus, actively denying genocide. The first step towards reconciliation and healing is to accept that a wrong occurred. When you deny that, you deny someone's very existence and very identity. And that has certainly caused me a lot of grief, both personally as a Hindu American, and also politically, as someone who traditionally did vote Democratic, I think a lot of young Hindu Americans are caught in this fold and in this schism. And whether this is going to change remains to be seen, and how the Democratic Party is going to tackle this remains to be seen as well.
So the partisanship that we experienced at that hearing last week on October 22nd was very palpable, and particularly two members of the Democratic Party who were extremely antagonistic towards the one panelist who had actually been in Kashmir on the day of the abrogation, as well as was a credible journalist with a very high degree of professionalism. Was extremely disheartening to me and to many of us, including HAF. So I want to rewind a little bit, and I want to put this in the context of what had happened actually last month, or 2 months ago now, and that's Howdy Modi. I actually worked on the committee that brought the members of Congress there, and also worked with the president and his advance team. And of course, the president's presence at Howdy Modi was a question mark for us. How is our community going to react? Because 80% of our community does statistically vote Democratic. And that auditorium had about 40 to 50,000 people, which is essentially, about 1% roughly of the entire Indian American population, albeit the vast majority of those people were from Texas, but you can say that that was a sample size. Not one person booed for the president, not one person was disrespectful or heckled him, and they gave him a standing ovation when they agreed with him, and my wife, who doesn't vote, or would probably never vote for Donald Trump, didn't stand for him at all, but she was respectful, and I think that really made an impression on the president, and because he knows this as well. And he knows that, and I have to say, as someone who's not necessarily a fan of his rhetoric, but I'm also not necessarily turned off by the things that he does, and I can look at things from an objective point of view. I have to say that was probably his best speech that he's ever made in his entire presidential career. Because he knew his audience. He knew that his audience, those people were not necessarily his supporters, but they could support the emphasis that he puts on the U.S.-India relationship and on the value of the U.S.-India relationship, and then on Hindu Americans and other communities in the diaspora as a whole. I feel that sentiment gets lost in the broader narrative now, and I worry that India and support for the U.S.-India relationship and essentially support for Hindu narratives is going to become a Republican pet issue the way that Israel has become a Republican pet issue these days. And I do worry about that. And we as Indian Americans need to wake up to the political reality that we cannot let this happen either. We must engage both sides of the aisle effectively in order to ensure that our narrative does not become usurped by anyone for any one political agenda. And I hope that we can collectively as a community come to mature ourselves and mature the institutions that we invest in to bring that about. And we should be engaging Republican lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers, independent lawmakers effectively in order to ensure that our way of life does not become a cause for any one party to use their bully pulpit for. It is a real concern that I think many of us who are engaged in this process have.
Thank you, Jim. So I have a lot of good questions from the audience. I think some of them were answered organically by some of your responses. So I thank you for that, and I thank you for being willing to be thrown under the bus by me on a very hot topic. But I mean, if the kind of conversation that we've had here is reflection of what we need more in Washington, D.C., I think we should share this footage. So before we end, we have only 5 minutes. For those of you, if we didn't get to your questions or you feel that you didn't get an answer, lunch is next. So you can let them eat, but maybe ask your questions then as well. But maybe if we could get each of you very briefly, there's five of you in 5 minutes, so 1 minute each. What do you tell the next generation that's interested in doing something that still is, in some sense, non-traditional for our community? We'll start here.
My advice would be very simple. Just do it honestly and believe in yourself, like to your heart's content. Apart from being a lawyer, an activist, and an advocate, I'm also a singer and a professional recording artist. For me, being active in the arts and in humanities has allowed my potential, my greatest potential to come out. And something my mom always tells me is do what you're good at, don't do something that you would be mediocre at. I knew from the beginning that if I was going to be a doctor, if I was going to go into the STEM fields, I would be unhappy, miserable, and I would fail at it. Why? Because it doesn't cater to my natural strengths and my natural abilities. Now, doing what I do, I feel like I'm able to make a greater impact. And I just want to tell also young people that there's really no set convention or way to live life. The greatest disservice you can do is not being true to your passion. If you follow that and if you have resilience in that, it really does lead you to greatness. My message also for parents would be to encourage your children to explore the humanities. We need more Hindu Americans in politics, journalism, media, entertainment, comedy, music, what have you. And that's really how we can bring our opinions and our voices into the American fabric and into the American story.
Thank you. We just go down the line this way now.
So I agree with what Vindhya said. The only thing I would add is that, we talk often about, politics, and I'm glad we have people who are involved in sort of the public sector but not elected, is that, being involved in politics is not just running for office, right? I think that, in fact, we may tell too many people to run for office, but, voting and being a part of civic society is as important. Joining Rotary clubs and boards and commissions and charitable organizations outside of our own community are just as important. And some of this is natural progression. I think that there's a lot of consternation in our community that we don't have enough lawyers, we don't have enough politicians, etc. What we have to understand is that the generation that came here, which is many of you and is my parents too, follow the path of a traditional immigrant community. The first generation tries to survive, and then they try to thrive, and then the next generation gets involved civically and culturally and politically and socially. And so I don't really stress about this as much because it's going to happen. I am probably as weird as it sounds, I'm probably the oldest of that generation, right? I think that there will be people who follow me, but I'm probably the first to do it. And so I think that some of that is naturally occurring and will naturally occur. We just have to let it. And so to Vindhya's point on the parents issue, if you can even just make it like 10% easier, right? That would be great. Just 10, let us be like 10% more. That would have made my life a lot easier. Thank you.
I would just touch upon something that Representative Tani said early, and Vindhya touched upon, that I'll say as someone who's not Hindu, is that Representative Tani said that part of his influence to run for public office is the base of the religion of good over evil, and I think that really I really would encourage Hindu Americans to really communicate more about the religion to non-Hindus, because I think more often than not, as someone who's an elected official, the events I go to for the Indian community, they tend to be very cultural, Diwali and celebrating certain celebrations, but really nothing about the religion. And I think educating non-Hindu Americans about the roots of the religion and how that influences your values and the work that you do is really critical. Bindia talked about her work for a Jewish organization serving refugees, and I would respectfully suggest that I think in many ways the Jewish community is a great model, because there are the sort of cultural celebrations for the Jewish community, but also in the district I represent, which also has a large Jewish community, very strongly communicated how those values interact with supporting immigrants and the story of many Jewish Americans' journey to America and roots going back much earlier, connecting those values to issues that I think translates into a stronger connection to people who aren't Jewish, to the Jewish community, influences the policies and what the community advocates for. And so I think that's a very strong model, and certainly I would like to see that happen at more of the Hindu or Indian American events that I attend, and I think it'll lead to a greater impact of the community in general. Thank you very much.
I would encourage us in our local communities to think outside the box and also to build alliances with other communities. And I'll give two examples that came out of Howdy Modi. Obviously, it was on a world stage, so we were very cautious and aware of the optics. So two things we did. Number one, we had Spanish media, Univision and Telemundo, cover the event. So to expose a Spanish-speaking audience, which arguably may become the largest demographic in the United States between now and 2050 or so, whatever the year is, we wanted to expose them to India. We wanted to set that narrative. So I felt that was a good win for us. The coverage was actually really good. You can Google it. The second thing we did was, this was the 150th year of Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, and there clearly is a nexus between Mahatma Gandhi's vision and his message and Dr. Martin Luther King, who also visited India. And we wanted to combine that message, and so we had an Indian a cappella choir perform with a black gospel choir. They performed a fusion Vaishnava Janato and Amazing Grace rendition that really it gave people goosebumps, including myself. And you can Google for the video, and it was quite a moment that we share. And I feel that we need to think outside the box also with our culture, and we are universal, so let's be universal.
Thanks, Steve. So I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is volunteer. But then I'm going to also say, as a former board member of HAF, give to organizations like HAF that advocate, and also give to candidates, give to people who are in office, not just our own, the people who reflect our values. I'm sure Neeraj and I wouldn't mind you coming talking to us about our campaigns and where we're going next.
NeerajPani.com/donate.
Electpadmakupad.com as well. But I think that you have to look at, Indiaspora did a report, and I don't know how many of you are familiar, but how our community, we build a lot of temples. But it's time now to build the infrastructure to live in this country as proud Hindus. We've educated children, like people who have grown up like Vindhya, who I'm just so proud to hear her at the other end as a fellow Telugu. I'm just very excited that she went into this. I would say, along with Neeraj, not everyone has to run for office, because as you know, if we don't get reelected, there's no income. And so to find a job in the public sector, as Jay, Suhag, and Vindhya have all done, I think it's really important, because you can influence policy. If we care about water, I went to Hyderabad at the age of 15. I could not stand the fact that you couldn't open the tap and get a glass of water. So we want to protect water infrastructure. As Indian Americans who understand what this is like, as Hindus who understand the essential element that water is in our lives, we could advocate on these issues. So I think it's really important that we learn to volunteer, to invest, and to be outspoken. Johnny though is not enough anymore, right? I mean, this is the thing. We have to do something. If our children and future generations of our, Hindu Americans are to be successful, and future generations of Americans are to be successful, we need to protect our democracy.
Thank you. So hopefully this panel has left you hungry to change the world and hungry for lunch. So thank